You need to know the basics and you need to know them extremely well. I'm sure you heard this before, and once in a while it's very useful for you to go back and try to play some lines and just work on what you can do with just the simple basic arpeggio and scale choices for a chord progression. When you do that, then you work on being better at using rhythm, creating stronger melodies and improving your phrasing. Those are all things that you always want to work on and always want to improve. In the end, it's more important that you can create strong melodies with basic materials, and it's not that important that you can use altered pentatonic scales and superimpose magic arpeggios. My name is Jens Larsen. Learn jazz, make music. The things you need to know for this video are really basic. So we're really talking about just knowing the major scale in one position, knowing some arpeggios in that position, and it's also very useful to practice that scale in the diatonic arpeggios. These are exercises that you're probably already working on, you probably already know them, and it's also stuff that I've covered in tons of videos. And in this video, I'm going to show you 7 solid jazz licks and talk about how you can use that as inspiration and use some of the same concepts and ideas to create better jazz licks yourself. This first example is really just the simplest of the simplest, because I'm just using the basic 1 octave arpeggio of D minor and also the 1 octave arpeggio of G7. So what makes this work is that I'm rhythmically doing some things that are really giving it some life and some energy. And that's because I'm first just playing the arpeggio, and then I'm following it up with this phrase. And here I'm going to the G7 on the B, but it's not on the 1 of that bar, it's on the forehand. So I'm anticipating the G7 and I'm actually going to the G7 before the bar really gets there, and that keeps the harmony and the melody really moving forward. Then we get the G7 arpeggio. And then I'm repeating that concept on the C major 7, so I'm resolving from G7 to C on the forehand. And this is really giving it some forward motion and making the melody sound a lot more interesting. And you definitely want to work on playing towards the forehand in your lines and trying to resolve or change chord on the forehand. It is amazing what you can do just with the basic chord tones or arpeggio notes. And in this case, the D minor line is again just using those chord tones. Everything is just these notes, which is just 1 octave of D minor 7. Again, the rhythm is used more actively, so I'm not just all playing 8th notes. And the second half of the D minor bar is really just there to create momentum and to pull us toward the first note of the G7, so the B. So that means that this, especially with the trill, is really just there to create movement and then to get us to that next chord. And this idea of thinking forward and really trying to make melodies that move to the next chord is something that's super essential in terms of getting something to sound like bop, because that's one of the things that bebop and Bach have in common. But of course, when rhythm is important in jazz, then that doesn't mean that we're only playing 8th notes. So you can also make some interesting lines using quarter notes. And in this example, that's pretty much what I'm working with. So the first part of this, the D minor bar, is sort of really trying to emphasize the 8th note offbeat. So that means we get the F is on the offbeat, and we also have accents on the 2 other notes, the C and the D. But then once we get to the G7, I'm contrasting this by really emphasizing the downbeat and also really using quarter note rhythms. So we get, and then resolving on the forehand to the C major 7. You can use rhythm to create tension, similar to how you can use an alto dominant to create tension in the harmony. That's what I'm doing with the 2-5-1 line. So first we have sort of a lot of movement and a continuous stream of notes on the D minor 7, with a trill in there also, to really also drive things forward. And then on the G7, then there are a lot fewer notes, but they're all off the beat, and that's really creating much more tension. And once I resolve to the C major 7, then that's back on the beat. So the first examples focused on using rhythm to keep things moving along and make it interesting. And you can also use chromaticism that I'll get to in a few of the later examples. And in this example, I'm working with melodies that change direction a lot more, because that's another way to keep it interesting to listen to and less predictable. The first part is a D minor line. It's just using the scale and it's ascending. So then we get a descending D minor line, taking us to the G7. And here I'm skipping down, and instead of having this descending movement, I'm skipping down and playing an ascending arpeggio, adding a trill, and then again changing the direction and adding an ascending E minor 7 arpeggio. So that's the arpeggio from the third of C major 7. Now I'm starting to use some basic chromaticism in the lines, and this example just starts with a chromatic phrase already. So I'm targeting the D, the root of the D minor, but I'm starting a scale tone above, so the E, going down to a half step below, the C sharp, sliding back in place. And that's a really useful way to use chromaticism, where you're using sort of the extra tension of the chromatic note, but you're resolving it in a subtle way by using legato. In this case it's a slide, could also be a hammer-on or a pull-off. Then just continuing up the scale, and then a few leading notes, or one leading note in fact. Going to the G7, which is really just using the arpeggio from the third of G7, which is a B half diminished arpeggio, but then playing a pattern in this. And then again a chromatic leading note to take us down to C major 7 on the G, and then an E minor triad. And of course, you can also take all the different things that I've covered in the previous examples and then put them into one example. And that's what I'm doing here at the end. The first part is really just a chromatic enclosure, aiming for the third of the chord, so the F on D minor, and then we get this enclosure. Then from there I'm playing the arpeggio of the chord, but I'm playing it using an eighth note triplet. So first down to the D, and then the triplet, taking us and really also pointing towards that B on the G7, so we get a really strong transition from one chord to the next. And here I'm just running up the arpeggio, so from B to D, and then adding a chromatic enclosure to take us to the E on C major 7 so that it resolves. And I'm sort of spreading that out, so I'm adding a lot more upbeats just to get a little bit more rhythmical tension on the dominant, and then resolve that back on the beat on the C major 7. I'm curious if you work like this as well, because for myself I find it extremely useful to sometimes take a song and then dial it back a bit and play some solos just using the basic arpeggios, or in other ways explore how I can get better at playing stronger melodies or have more interesting rhythms and better phrasing. So leave a comment if you are also working like this, or if you have another suggestion to work in a similar way. Another thing that you definitely want to have in your vocabulary is triads. Using triads on top of chords as a part of your melodic language is really something that's gonna make your lines sound a lot better, and the triad is a very strong melodic unit, so it's well worth checking out. And if you want to check out how to work with that in solos, then check out this video where I'm covering how to find triads and how to use them in some solid lines.